So here on the evening sequence, my guests this evening are the Brian Jonestown Massacre, and I'm speaking to Anton Newcombe, the prime mover of the band, and the spirit has guided it through from the early days in San Francisco in 1990 through to the present day in London in 2003. Is that correct, Anton?
It's fairly correct. You know, that's not really the emphasis that I wanted to present.
How would you like it presented?
Well, no, I'm just saying, you know, it always is a band. It's a difficult thing to do. People don't appreciate how hard it is to like build a consensus or something like that and keep it. You know, it's akin to having, if you're playing with 5 people, unless you're paying them to sort of bite their tongue, it's like having 5 girlfriends, you know, and managing that relationship. And everybody knows how hard it is to, you know, get what you want out of a relationship.
What interests me is that there have been multiple lineups over the years, and yet there's an identifiable sound that has remained consistent. You still sound like the Brian Jonestown Massacre, despite different people playing in it. And it's not that you're ordering people to play exactly this note or play exactly that note, but you manage to recruit or attract people who will play with a level of commitment to the particular approach that the band embodies.
Well, that's not exactly a correct analysis of what it is that I do.
Tell me.
Well, it's a mystery.
Okay, a mystery is good.
I conceive of ideas as a whole, and I have incredibly demanding. I mean, I have a vision, and I want it played a certain way, and there's a certain amount of flexibility, but it's like more like the individuals in our lives and the process that we've taken to come here to London in 2003 is very odd, and everything else is very ordered. You know, the ideas, nobody's going to really understand. There's different ways that it comes about, but I'll be playing guitar and think of a whole song symphonically in my head. Every drum beat, every, you know, all of it. So, and I've always been that way, and it's frustrated the process. Actually, when we started out and we were teaching each other how to play music, because I really taught myself how to play guitar, and then the next people that came in the band, I taught them how to play, besides Rick, who is here tonight, doing wonderful on the 12-string. You know, and...
who's in the current lineup of the band now?
Well, one guitarist is Frankie Emerson, Frankie Teardrop, and there's Rick Miami, and he's playing the other guitar. There's Tommy Dietrich on bass, Daniel Allaire on drums, and myself. You know, you've already introduced me. But it's odd, you know, I've kept these people. It's sort of like journalistic, it's laziness, you know, that people keep repeating that, because you don't look at Chuck Berry and realize that he's never had a band, you know, and you don't look at Beck and realize that he's been through hundreds, you know, and you don't look at James Brown and realize that that's not the band.
I think the difference is that with someone like Neil Young, who has an identifiable sound that has continued down the decades, with a particular purpose and a mission and a sound and approach, he's put himself out under his own name rather than under a band name. What's interesting with the Massacre is that it's the Brian Jonestown Massacre rather than Anton Newcombe. And it's really interesting to meet somebody who, as far as I can ascertain, has no interest in rock stardom as such, no interest in becoming embarrassingly rich, but it's the mission of the music and the art itself which is driving you. And that's quite rare.
But it also speaks to the power of what real art can do, you know, in any medium. I mean, that's... the difference is, I think fame, I look at fame as a burden, and I like to live very humbly and encourage other people. Like, I didn't get beat up on this trip, and I speak my tongue. It's just, I appeal to people's common decency in the quickest way that I can. And for me, you know, I'm not that impressed with mainstream culture at this point, you know, and as a whole, not just in the arts. I'm not that impressed with it, so I live in a world largely of my creation, my own creation, and I've just chosen to set about this, and I'm very committed. It's what I decided I wanted to do, you know? Because I can do other things. I'm competent as an engineer, and I understand the technical things. I'm a wonderful sculptor, you know? I believe I could do anything I want to do. This is what I want to do, and I like to help people out. Unfortunately, everybody... I mean, there's a line around the block to jump into the fire, and I think people need to need to look at the situation and what you'll get into. Because it's kind of like you're a stallion and you're running around, or a filly, it doesn't matter, guy or girl, but you're running around and some cowboys come up to you and they say, we're taking you as a horse. You really have to negotiate the size of your corral in this world, you know, and a lot of people just don't understand. They don't understand that that's going to come along with it. There's, you know, the wonderful part, you know, to have people acknowledge you and say they love you, but there's the other part of it. It's the burdens and the responsibilities you have to really provide. And you know, I'm very much have a different attitude than somebody like Oasis or something, where it appears that it's not really what they want to do, when I know damn well that they worked very hard to get where they're at. I just don't like that.
Now, what's interesting, you mentioned the O word there, with bands like Oasis and countless others that have a kind of retro approach, it manifests itself in clothing, it manifests itself in the superficial sound of the band or the chord sequences or something. But it seems to me that your relationship with 1967, which I understand is when you were born, you're the first person of that generation I've met that actually has picked up on something of the sensibility that uses it merely as a polarizing filter through which to view your particular journey, rather than just to imitate the superficial appearance of it.
Well, I can articulate this so quickly. There was a spirit that was occurring, especially from the Isles, but all around the world, of that anything was possible. And it was a kind of optimism that fascinated me, and I tapped into it as a very young child. The thing that I love about the Beatles isn't Sir Paul, you know? The thing that I love about it is that they got to a point where they could play sitar music, country music, psychedelic rock music, symphonic compositions, and it was all, hey, I can accept that. That's the new Beatles record. Isn't this wonderful? And the only other people that really have that is kind of Amnesiac. When Radiohead isn't sort of acting up, you know, being reactionaries. Like when they got down to the business of that album, I think I had to sit back and scratch my head, because it was really, I mean, Nigel Goodrich he's got to be the best producer around. I mean, Beck will never have a better sounding record. You can't do any better. I mean, and I'm fascinated by it.
Now, obviously, the kind of no-brainer question that every journalist, I'm sure, must bore you stupid with is picking up on the Brian Jones reference. But it seems to me, having lived through that time, being born in 1950 and being a teenager through the 60s, that when we first heard Little Red Rooster come on as a pop single, and there's this slide guitar, and nobody has made a pop record that sounded like that before. Satisfaction turns up, and there's fuzz guitar on it. We think it's saxophone, because nothing sounded like that before.
Voted the best song of all time.
Along comes Paint It Black, and there's a sitar for the first time in pop music there. And the sounds of 19th Nervous Breakdown, of Have You Seen Your Mother, Baby, just pushing...
Under My Thumb with the marimbas.
With the marimbas, and then I'm Waiting, and Sweet Lady Jane with the dulcimer. The whole thing is the Stones were pushing the envelope at that point, the Jones-era Stones. And am I correct in supposing that is why you've chosen Brian Jones as an emblem to reflect that innovation? Well,
people don't really realize, because history, you know, is sort of dictated by the victors, and you have this situation. People don't realize, if you read old copies of Jazz magazine, he was sort of the face of British youth culture, and you have to remember the Blitz. And the reality is, in America, from the Depression, because they waited out a lot of the dirty bits, and the Germans never got into America that in the same way as having V2s flying over your head and having you separated from your mom and dad and sent to a farm. People don't have the perspective. There was this establishment, and that just average parents of that era were much more conservative. They didn't know what was going to happen with the future, and they were holding on to their money. And the kids were like, wait a minute, we're going to go out and spin. And fashion, culture, everything exploded. And he was very much the male face of that. People don't know that all the phenomena of swing in London and all that jazz was a trick, like simultaneously. They were trying to get sort of British gents, like average people, to spend money on clothes and care about fashion. And he was really concerned with those things, but also he had a deep love and appreciation. Obviously, it shows in what he brought to the game, you know.
Absolutely. Alexis Corner was a friend of mine towards the end of his life, and talked about Brian having been very much in terms of music as opposed to the terms of a fashion icon. And I remember his last interview for the Melody Maker just before he died, when he'd left the Stones but was still giving interviews.
Yes.
He talked about how he was preparing a jazz album for adults and a children's nursery rhyme album for kids. But then he had a little think and he thought, or maybe I'm going to make jazz for kids and nursery rhymes for grown-ups.
What a wonderful thought. But it sort of presented that he was like out of his head at the end of his life, and you know, I don't believe it. I don't believe it one bit, because I've read his writings and I know that he was focused. I'm certainly, you know, from the amount, you know, his shape changed. Like he's a solid, sturdy guy. He wasn't going to stay skinny forever. You know, he got a little bit thicker, and
I believe
he was
also
very articulate right up until the day he died.
I believe that the getting thrown out of the Stones, which is basically what happened, was a massive shock to the system that did in fact make him wake up and re-energize himself. And he was on the way to
I'm not saying
some kind